The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 13th chapter. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, 'Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" The word of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. She was a faithful member of the congregation and had been member for many, many years, decades even. She knew pretty much everybody in the church. And she had come to that point where she really appreciated those who had stuck it out because they had lived with some pretty nasty conflicts together. And in fact, after the last conflict, the church was starting to show decline. And so she, being faithful and really wanting to see her church kind of turn to hope, was really glad when that new young pastor came. And it wasn't a lot later, though, when he called a special congregational meeting. And the purpose of that meeting was to disclose allegations that a man who was long since dead had abused children in the congregation. That this abuse had happened a long, long time ago. And there was a felt need to make sure that everybody was aware of it. What was worse was he didn't just let it lie after making that announcement. He brought in a counselor the next week to meet with those members of the congregation who wanted to talk about it some more, who wanted to learn more about how this kind of abuse could happen, how these things can go on, and why it would be that decades later, only decades later, would these allegations come to light. She heard grumbling about what was being said about this beloved, now deceased member of the congregation, and she heard grumbling against that pastor, and she feared that yet another conflict was coming for them as a church. She loved her church. She loved the people who were gathered on Sunday morning with them, and she loved that pastor. And so she found a time when she could draw him aside and say to him, "You know, I'm not really sure this is helpful. I'm not really sure that keeping on with this is something we need to be doing." In short, she was saying, "Cool it." There's a much stronger way of saying that, but I'm guessing you can figure that one out. Because she cared, she wanted to keep the peace at all costs. In many ways, I've come to believe that the Pharisees get a bad rap. Many times when we hear the word Pharisees, we think of all these negative kinds of things about who these people are. But the truth of the matter is, the Pharisees were the good and faithful people who showed up all the time, who did the work that needed to be done, who paid attention to the scriptures, paid attention to the rules and about how we ought to do things. They're the kinds of people that most pastors are very happy to have in the life of a congregation. The problem with Pharisees is sometimes that attention to the rules becomes rigid. Sometimes what is intended to be something that includes everyone, when you start generalizing those expectations to everyone, what happens is you start drawing lines, circles that exclude people rather than include them. And that's where Jesus had his issues with the Pharisees. But let us not be mistaken. They were people who loved their religious community and who were trying to the very best of their ability to love God's people. And so today, when we hear the Pharisees, who frankly have been aware of this Jesus for quite some time, he's been teaching and healing and doing all kinds of things in their midst for quite a while. And in the story, the point at which we pick it up, Jesus has already had that transfiguration moment up on the mountain. He has already come down off that mountain, and he has now set his face for Jerusalem. What that means is Luke is telling us that Jesus has started that long journey that will ultimately lead him to enter into Jerusalem in that last week, when the conflict is going to escalate and escalate and escalate until ultimately he is betrayed and crucified and dies. Now, the Pharisees' response to this kind of activity on Jesus' part is an age-old response. It's a response that, quite frankly, we can go back to Moses. Remember when the people were in Egypt and they cried out for help? And God sends Moses, and Moses starts to challenge Pharaoh to let my people go. And what does Pharaoh do? He makes it worse for the people. When you start working for justice, when you start trying to change the way things are, things often get messy. It starts to get dangerous. And the Pharisees were starting to see that indeed it was getting dangerous. John, the baptizer, Jesus' buddy, had been beheaded by now. And the Pharisees understood that if we can keep the peace with the Roman government, remember that the Roman government had given the Jewish community some special exceptions when it came to ritual and to religious practice. They didn't want to see all that fall apart. And if you take a look at a good many prophets, the Jewish community hadn't always shown themselves to be particularly willing to listen to people who were calling them to a different way of doing things. And so today, sensing the danger of Jesus coming, these Pharisees, some would say they are good Pharisees, seek Jesus out and they say, "Go away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." It's quite possible they really did have Jesus' best interest in mind. It's also quite possible that they had their own interests in mind, keeping the peace, keeping things from getting too messy, keeping things so Herod and the Roman Empire does not crack down on them. whatever the reasons were, they were in a place where they felt a need to come and say their own version of what I suspect is, I'm not so sure this is really helpful. Now, how does Jesus respond? He does not cower, and he does not turn tail and run. In fact, what he does is, he responds, some would call it with defiance. He responds, you tell that fox, Herod, that I will be here casting out demons and performing cures, not just today, not just tomorrow, but the day after that. I will be here and I will continue to do what I'm doing. I am headed in the direction that I am headed. I am called to go this direction, and I am going to follow the path that is laid out before me. Remember, Luke has told us Jesus has set his face toward Jerusalem. He knows where he's going. He knows what he has to do. Now, I'm guessing that the Pharisees weren't really looking forward to that kind of a response. Now, in our culture, it's possible to understand being called a fox to be a compliment. But let me assure you, in the first century, calling somebody a fox was not a compliment. So instead of turning around and backing off or getting quiet or whatever, Jesus actually escalates the conflict right there. But he goes on and he says that in Jerusalem, it is the town in which, in fact, he says that he must go to Jerusalem because no prophet is killed outside of Jerusalem, right? In his own way, remember, he's already predicted his passion, his death, and resurrection with his disciples. But he, in his own way, is now telling the Pharisees where this is going, and he understands what's at stake, and that he accepts it. Now, some might expect that he's going to be angry or he's going to respond in any number of other ways to this, but instead what he does is he laments. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills its prophets and stones those who have been sent to it. And then, how many times have I wanted to draw your children to me like a hen draws its brood under its wings? There's this wonderful imagery of God's love. God's love being so powerful, so big, that it seeks to provide protection even to the people who would reject God and reject God's ways and reject the ways that God is moving in their midst. Let me cover you and care for you and protect you and love you and offer you forgiveness and life and a new way of being. And in the midst of that, Jesus shows us, first of all, that there are some powerful, and it's not just here, feminine images of who God is and how God functions. But more so, God makes a commitment, Jesus makes a commitment that no matter how messy things get, he will follow the course that brings justice and life and well-being for all people, for you and for even those who aren't quite as faithful. That God's love is that big. Now, during this Lenten season, we respond to that love by coming to worship, by hearing God's word proclaimed, by hearing the gifts of grace in the word proclaimed, in the readings and in the scriptures and in the singing of songs. but also as we gather at the table for this meal through the sacraments. For this is a season when we respond to God's love by being empowered to go out and love others, to care for others, to walk with others in the messiness of their life, to be in our own way God's wings covering those who are at risk. But in the end, we have the promise that as much as it can get messy, and as much as sometimes we look around us and we say, I'm not all that confident this is helpful, somehow in the midst of it, we have the promise that God is doggedly working for the well-being of all.